we are going to be exploring Perspective Efex today. We're going to be 99% of the time playing in Perspective Efex. I'm going to jump into another plugin just at one point, just very quickly, just to kind of finish up an image. But we are primarily going to be working with Perspective Efex, both from a corrective and from a creative perspective. We are going to be starting by showing you how to get into the plugin from the three primary apps, from PhotoLab 3, from Photoshop, and from Lightroom. And then we're going to work on basically correcting a bunch of images of varying levels of distortion, some that are very slight, need a little bit of correction, and some that have some pretty severe distortion. Whether that may have been intentional or not, we'll kind of make those decisions as we go, and just straighten some things out. And then, of course, we're going to end up with a little bit of miniaturization effect, which is always a whole lot of fun. So we're going to start in PhotoLab, and I'm going to use this same photo to get into Perspective Efex from three different apps, from PhotoLab, Photoshop, and Lightroom. So let's just start here in PhotoLab. So this is DxO's PhotoLab 3. I haven't done anything to the photo yet. You can see right here, the reset button is not available because this is the reset image. And I think what's kind of interesting is you'll see this same photo in a moment in Photoshop and in Lightroom, and you'll see quite a difference. In fact, why don't we just do that right now? I'll jump over to Lightroom, not that Lightroom, let me quit that Lightroom. Jump over to Lightroom Classic, and you'll see the same photo here. And again, this is, double check it, it's reset. This is the default view of this picture, and you can see it's quite different than what we're seeing in PhotoLab. So PhotoLab has already done a fair amount of enhancement to it, and you'll see the same thing when we jump into Photoshop. And I just point that out for anyone who's not yet familiar with PhotoLab to reiterate that a lot happens to the picture just by opening it in PhotoLab. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Perspective Efex. So to get into that, I want to click on this button down here that says Nik Collection. Click on that, and when you first bring it up, you have what's called the plugin selector, an option to choose which plugin you want to go into, and we're going to choose Perspective Efex. But before I do that, I want to point out the settings option at the bottom. If you click on the settings button, you can choose how that photo is going to be handed off to the plugin. You have the ability to choose to export it without processing. Because this is a raw file, it actually has to be processed. So we definitely want to send it off as either a TIFF or a JPEG. And really, honestly, I can't come up with any good reason to use JPEG for something like this. I think we always want to go into TIFF because that's going to allow us the most flexibility with the file moving forward. You can choose whether you want it to be an 8 or a 16-bit TIFF. That is completely up to you. And the general advice that I give on this is if you're going to be doing a lot of really heavy color correction, you do want to be in 16-bit. But if you're just going to be doing a little bit of work, then you can safely go to 8. Of your ICC profile, again, I'll just answer this now because the question will likely come up if I don't. You can choose, again, it's very much up to you. If you have chosen in camera, which is most likely what you've done, to shoot in either sRGB or Adobe RGB, you can just leave it as shot and it'll take that profile, carry that profile over. If you want to be sure, you can set it to sRGB, which is generally used for screen viewing. If you know you're only going to be sharing your image on screen, set it to sRGB. That way the colors that you create in the software will look that way on everybody's screen, at least as much as one can control. If, however, you're going to go to print, then you probably do want to go to Adobe RGB as you get a little bit more color depth, a little bit more color space rather, when you're working in Adobe RGB. For our purposes of our demo, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose sRGB and then click on Perspective Efex, which is going to render out that 8-bit TIFF file in, I believe sRGB is what I chose, and it will open that up into Perspective Efex. Now, once we're in the plugin here, we have a whole bunch of choices. We're going to take a look at a bunch of this as we go throughout the demo today. But just to start, I'm going to make things really easy by clicking the auto button. Now, before I do it, let's just take a look at the photo and see what we are going to be correcting. This is in San Francisco. You can see that this building is kind of leaning forward, tilting forward a bit, shot with a bit of a wide angle lens, shot pointing up slightly. So we're getting that perspective tilt on there, and that's what I want to correct. And so there's a lot of different ways I could go about this, but the easiest one is to simply click on the auto button here, and the software is going to automatically look for those vertical lines, base the correction off of that. And of course, there's lots of vertical lines in here for the software to grab, and it has just done that correction, and that's it. I mean, that is literally all that I have to do. One click, auto perspective, and we're done. So this again started from PhotoLab, and PhotoLab into Perspective Efex does have a bit of a quirky workflow, and so I want to make sure that you see what we do next. You'll notice there is no save button, there's no apply button, there's no OK button. the only thing you can do here is hit save. Now, if I just hit Command S, your standard Control S on a PC, is going to bring up your save as dialog, which is unfortunate because it's actually going to save yet another file. I've already generated a new TIFF. This will generate another TIFF. And if we look under the menu here, you'll see what's happening. Command S, which normally you would see as a simple save command, is actually save as, which is not what we need here. What we really want to do is just hit save because there's no reason to create that additional file. So it does mean that I need to manually go up here and choose save. And then it's going to, again, ask me to confirm the bit depth of that file. And then I can click OK and it saves it. And this way it's not going to generate that additional file. I do recognize this is a bit of a quirky workflow and it's something that DxO will work on for future releases, but as it stands, that's the way it is. And then once that's done, you can close this window or just choose to quit Perspective Efex. It is quite literally launching into a separate application at this point, and that's why we're seeing this odd workflow. Once that's done, now you have the two images here, the original raw one that we started with and the corrected one. And from here, of course, we can move on to do whatever other work we want to do. So that's the workflow out of PhotoLab. Let's go into Photoshop next and go through the same process. So Photoshop, you would open up your raw file. So I've got it saved here as in my recents. I'll just click on that to open it up. Oh, and I moved it, so we'll have to start that over again. Let's just select that file. I moved it into my Perspective folder. And there she is. I want to make sure I'm opening the raw file, not the TIFF that I grabbed earlier. Let's open this up. And this is going to open into Camera Raw because it is a raw photo. And notice here the look of the picture. It looks quite different than what we saw in PhotoLab because PhotoLab had already done a lot of work to it. I'm going to let Photoshop do its version of the automatic work just by clicking on the auto button. It does a bit of work to that. You can see it is definitely better than it was. I think we could do a little bit more to it, but again, that's not the purpose of today's demo. I just want to get into editing the photo. Now, quite often when you see me do demos using Photoshop, at this stage of opening the image into Camera Raw, I would tell you to go down here and open this as a smart object. And by opening that as a smart object, you will have the ability to do a lot of work that you can edit later on. If you open something as a smart object, most of the Nik Collection filters will be applied as a smart filter. However, Perspective Efex doesn't work that way. So there's no advantage to opening it as an object. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on open and open it as a normal file. At this point, let's make that nice and big. I can go in here and go to the filter menu, go to Nik Collection and choose Perspective Efex. Now, the advantage of the smart object is once again that you would be able to re-edit the photo later, re-edit the filters later. And we don't necessarily want to lose that entirely. It's just that we don't get to do that for Perspective Efex. And there really isn't any advantage to that because once you fix it, there's nothing that you'd really want to unfix, if you will. So I'll show you how to kind of get back to that stage in just a moment here. But here you see we've opened this file into Photoshop and then into Perspective Efex. Once again, I'll click on the auto button just like before. It does the exact same job, straightens that out. And now I have a save button, which I can apply and it'll bring us back into Photoshop. And so you can see that that has been applied. It's a permanent application of the filter. There's no readjusting that. Of course, I can undo it if I need to, but there's no readjusting it. But at this point, if I wanted to apply a filter and apply that as a smart filter, let's say I wanted to take this into Color Efex Pro, but I wanted that to be a smart filter, I can at this point right click on this layer and convert that to a smart object. Now that that is a smart object, or once it is, as soon as Photoshop finishes doing what it's doing, there we go. Now that that is a smart object, if I go into a filter like Color Efex Pro 4 and make a change to this, and I'll just do something really quickly in here. Let's let that do its processing. You can see you even get a dialog here saying, hey, you have applied this to a smart object, which means this is now going to operate as a smart filter. And what that means is if I go in and let me just grab a recipe of something I've done previously, just grab something like this. Okay, so there's this vintage recipe that I've applied. We can see over here on the right, this is a combination of film grain, bicolor, and cross-processing filters. If I click OK and apply this filter in Photoshop as a smart filter on a smart object, what this means is that I can go back into this. There's my Color Efex Pro. Go back into this filter by double clicking on that, and it's going to open back up and let me pick up where I left off. And of course, I could do this at any point in the workflow. There we can see all the filters being applied. And if I change my mind about something, I could turn something off or change a setting, whatever I wanted. click OK, and that's going to bring us back. So this is one of the big advantages of using Photoshop for this workflow. Once you convert something to a smart object, you have effectively infinite ability to go back and re-edit the filters, the creative filters applied to that. All right, enough of this. Let me close out of here and let's take a look at our last app for working, where we're going to spend most of the rest of our time, and that is in Lightroom Classic. So once again, same photo in here, starting from the same place. You'll see that the image has been reset. There's no color effects applied to this. Once again, it does not look as good as it did in PhotoLab. So I'm going to go in here and just hit the auto tone button and let it do a little bit of work. And again, you know, it's better than it was, still not as good as PhotoLab, but that's okay for now. We're going to right click on this and choose to edit this in Perspective Efex. Now, just like from PhotoLab, I do need to choose what format I want to do this in. In PhotoLab, you choose it once. Here, you choose it every time you jump into it. By default, it is going to force me to go into edit a copy, because I can't edit the original because the original's a raw file. I can choose TIFF, Photoshop file, or JPEG. I'll leave it as TIFF. And the same discussion as before. We can choose the color space, bit depth, and so on. We'll go ahead and click on edit. It'll render out that TIFF file, open it up into the plugin. And once again, once we're in here, just as before, click on the auto perspective. It makes that correction. Click on save, and we are back into Lightroom. Now, again, here we do have a separate file. So we have this new TIFF file, which Lightroom, for some reason lately, is deciding to take a long time to show that, but we'll give it a minute. There we go. We see the thumbnail has drawn. It's thinking about the preview. It's refreshing the screen, and eventually, there we go. Oop. It's there, it's back, it's gone, and sooner or later, it'll show up. I promise you, it will. So before we move on, let me take a quick moment to jump over to the questions. First question that's come up, do you ever reduce the intensity of the perspective correction? Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm gonna show this in a moment here. If you're thinking about it from a creative perspective correction, sometimes you have an image that is distorted because, you know, we're looking up at it and we straighten it, and now the lines are all perfectly straight, but it doesn't really feel natural, because in your brain you're going, well, hold on a second, if I'm looking up at this building, I should be seeing some level of distortion. It doesn't really flow. And so by adjusting the amount of the correction, which again we'll look at in a moment here, I mean, you can get it back to a place where you feel like, okay, this looks more believable, looks more natural, looks more real, as opposed to something that's perfect but might not be accurate, might not feel natural. You would use the same argument with white balance. So for example, I'm actually here, I'll show you a great example of this. This photo here, shot in Amsterdam years ago, the lighting, the street lighting is so yellow that the camera with its auto white balance, it went crazy. So this looks kind of awful, right? If I go in here and I choose to manually white balance this off of a white part of the building, that is technically accurate, but it looks bad, right? This doesn't feel right. It's technically correct, at least the white is technically correct, but everything else just feels out of whack. And so sometimes it feels like you need to do a little bit more kind of balancing that out. And if I warm it up just a little bit, I'll get it to somewhere where I feel like, okay, that looks a little bit more natural. Same thing with perspective. Sometimes the correct perspective is just not right. It doesn't feel good. And so you want to kind of find something in the middle. And again, we'll take a look at that. That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. Next question is, if I use Perspective Efex, do I need to do lens correction in Lightroom? There's no one answer to that. You can try doing both. You can try doing lens correction in Lightroom and then perspective correction in Perspective Efex. You can do all the corrections, so the lens corrections and the perspective corrections in Perspective Efex, or you can do it all in Lightroom. It really is up to you, and sometimes one image will get handled, or one particular camera lens combination will get handled better in one app over another. And if it's an image that's really important to you, that you want to spend a lot of time figuring out the absolute best, then the only real answer is to try both. Try a different combination of things, see what works best for your photo, and that's really the only right answer. The right answer is to figure it out, play with it, and try. But either app will do it. They're just both going to do it from a slightly different approach, similar to raw processing, right? Lightroom, well, all Adobe products are using the same raw processing engine. DxO has its own raw processing engine. Apple has its own raw processing engine. One may or may not be better than another for a particular photo. The only way to find out is to try them out. So that's how that works. All right, that's it for questions right now. Let's jump back into it. Okay, moving on, let's now take a look at some perspective correction for real photos, and we're going to start with some real simple corrections, some that may not even look like they need correction, and then we're going to get into some pretty blatant ones that need a lot of correction, and this is where we're going to play with the amount and see how those react, and then we're going to might go into this one, and then we're going to go into some miniaturization. So let's start with this one here. My approach when photographing stuff like this is always to get everything right in camera at least as much as possible. Sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes, like for example, if I wanted to have more of this building up here with the wide angle lens that I had and how far back I could get on the street, it would be impossible to hold the camera perfectly vertical, perfectly perpendicular, I should say, to the buildings, and still get all the building that I wanted. So I may have to tilt the camera up a little bit, knowing that I'm going to be able to fix that later on. So that's what happened here. There's just a very slight amount of perspective correction that needs to happen, but I want to fix it. So let me start by doing an auto correction on this photo, get that looking a little bit cleaner in there, and then I'll right click on that and choose Edit in Perspective Efex and let it render out that TIFF. I'll just leave it at all the default settings here. And this is going to be another example of a very easy correction. Just clicking on the auto button is going to do everything for me. So here's my perspective options, click on auto, and boom, just like that, it straightens it out. The software has got a lot to work with here. Lots of known vertical lines, lots of known horizontal lines. So there is virtually no chance that the software is going to get this one wrong. This, in fact, looks great. Now, one of the things that's kind of fun about working in here is how you choose to crop the image after you have done the perspective correction. Cropping is automatically enabled. We'll see it's automatically cropped here. If I turn off the crop, then we see how the image has been distorted. So it wasn't a lot of distortion, but you can see what the software has done. And by distorting the image in this way, we're seeing these blank areas, these empty areas or negative space that's left here that obviously we don't want in the photo. We don't want that in there. That's going to look terrible. So we need to crop past that. And by default, the software is going to automatically crop past that for me. But I can change that. I can go into the crop manually and change it however I like. And I can choose to leave it at the same default aspect ratio as the original photo. Or if I don't care about aspect ratio, I could go over here under the aspect ratio dialog and choose to set that to, for example, unconstrained. And now I can set this to whatever ratio I want. So again, I don't care what the ratio is. I'm just going to share this online. So I will just set it either to maximize the amount of pixels in here or to just make a creative decision. So I can crop it like so, or I'll say, you know what? I actually want to go square on this. Kind of like the idea of going square. So let's go as maximum square as I can. Find the right crop that works for me, works for this photo, and I kind of dig that. So I'll choose that. Let's go ahead and apply that crop to it. We see the crop, how it's going to be applied. Sounds good. Click on save, and this is going to bring this back into Lightroom. Now from here, of course, I can continue to edit the photo however I want. So if I wanted to, say, add a creative effect to this, let's right click on this and edit again. And notice I'm working with the TIFF file here. There's the original raw, and you can see up here, if I move the mouse properly, you can see right there, this is a raw file. That's this one we started with. This is the one that I just created. It's got the .tiff at the end. So I'm going to right click on that one, edit that in, let's go into Silver Efex Pro. And at this point, I can choose to edit a copy, or since there's really no benefit to having this file as a separate file later, I'm just going to go ahead and choose Edit Original, not bother creating another new TIFF file, and just work with this TIFF inside of Silver Efex Pro. Now, because this is a TIFF file in Silver Efex, I do have multi-page technology, which means that if I make a correction to this image or a change to this image, I will actually be able to go back in and re-edit it later. That's something we've talked about a bunch in previous webinars. That's the new multi-page TIFF technology. It's part of the current Nik Collection. Anyway, now we're in Silver Efex Pro, so I can choose some filter effect in here. I'm gonna choose something kind of cool and fun. Let's go for this. Let's see, is that the one I want? Low key, or maybe something like this. Push processing, get something really kind of dramatic in there. Actually, I quite like that. A little bit of grain going on. Maybe I want to lighten up the buildings in here a little bit. Let's add a quick control point onto here, brighten up that center building on there just a touch, maybe add a little bit of heavy vignetting to the whole photo. That might look kind of cool. So let's go over here to vignetting. Let's choose a lens fall off. Let's see, which one do I want? Number 1, number 2, number 3. Let's go for number 2 in there. Maybe lighten it up a little bit. It's a little too dramatic. Lighten that up a little bit. And I dig it. I like it. So I'm going to click on save. And this is, of course, going to render back into Lightroom, where we will see that we don't have that extra tip hanging about. So there's my original raw image, which of course I can go back and start all over again from there, or I have the perspective corrected and cropped and treated in black and white version of that photo. So just kind of work through the workflow from beginning to end there. That's how you might want to approach that. All right, let's move to another photo. This is not one where at first glance it really doesn't seem like it needs anything. I mean, it all looks pretty good to me, but we're going to see that there actually is a little bit of correction we can do. Once again, I will do a auto correct on here, which actually does quite a nice job on there. Kind of lightens up the shadows, gives it quite a bit more detail. And then I'll right click on that and choose edit in Perspective Efex. And once again, leave it at the default settings. And we will choose, we're going to start with actually an auto perspective and see what happens. So before I hit the button, I'm going to do the auto again. I want you to watch these pillars in here. They all look, I mean, they look pretty vertical, I guess. The horizon, I think, is straight. I mean, it all looks pretty good, but let's just see what happens. So I hit auto, and yeah, no, that really didn't work, right? That just doesn't quite look right. It actually looks a little bit more distorted now. And I show you this to point out that auto is really looking for vertical lines and horizontal lines that it can base this off of, but sometimes it doesn't quite find the right lines. And so we don't like what it does. And so we want to do this by hand. So let me do that. Let's reset that. And to correct this one, I'm going to just use 2 vertical lines. By clicking on this little icon here, the 2 vertical lines, I can position these guys wherever I would like to make the correction. So I'm going to base this off of the lines that are farthest out on the bridge that I can get my hands on. Undoubtedly there's another pillar of the bridge over here, but I can't see it. That building is, I mean, I could base it off of that, but that building might be at a different perspective than the pillar of the bridge here. So I'm not going to go off of that. I'm just going to base it off of this. So let's do this. Let's get these lines right in the center of the column. And I'm going to choose the center of the column, not the edge of the column, because I can't really reliably go off the edge of the column in the reflection on the water. I mean, I suppose I could kind of eyeball it and say, you know, that's probably right. But instead, I'm going to go off of the middle of the column. So I'm going to, again, to be fair, I am kind of eyeballing it, but I'm going to choose to put that center point, that crosshair, right in the middle of the column, and do the same thing down here. Now, one of the things about this, if you've never seen this before, right now you'll notice that this crosshair is moving very, very rapidly. Notice underneath the circle where it's zoomed in, it says press shift to slow cursor. As I move my hand a tiny bit on the desktop, on my desk, that's moving a lot. As I hold down the shift key, now as I move it, it moves a lot more slowly. So it makes it easier to get that right into position. So what I'm trying to do here is get these crosshairs in as close to the center of that column from the actual column and the reflection as I can. Let's do the same thing here. Get this down, kind of center that on that column. Let's go for the reflection, center that on the reflection, right about like so. And then I'll click the preview button and see what we get. And now we get something that looks really good and clean. So now we can see those very nice vertical lines. And if we look at the original version of this, it's a very minor change, but now that you look at the uncorrected, you go, oh yeah, oh no, that definitely needed some work. And now that it's been corrected, it looks fantastic. So sometimes you need to take manual control of it. And the easiest way to do that is to grab either the vertical or the horizontal only lines. Of course, it depends on your image, and position them on known vertical or known horizontal lines in the scene, and away you go. So now that that's done, I'll go ahead and save that and bring that back into Lightroom. All right, let's move on to something that needs a lot more correction. Now, this is the kind of image where when I shot this, I probably really didn't have any intention of forcing this to be fixed later. But this is going to be particularly tricky because I don't want to lose all of this memorial here, right? It's kind of an important part of the shot. I don't want to totally crop this out. If I make these buildings completely, totally vertical, it's not going to feel quite right. To the question that we had earlier, if I just make this totally vertical, it's probably not going to look quite right. But let's just see. Let's see what happens. So let me do a quick little auto correction on here and open this guy up into Perspective Efex. Now, another kind of interesting point on this is this center building is not a perfectly straight up building, right? It's kind of pyramided in shape. It's tapered. It's smaller at the top than it is at the bottom. So automatic correction on here could really mess things up because the building isn't really straight to begin with. But let's just try it. Let's hit auto perspective and see what happens. So yeah, we can tell here this is definitely not going to work. So this building, while that line does look perfectly straight, and that one there looks perfectly straight, it's done a really good job, but it just doesn't work. Like, this photo doesn't look right anymore. So this is where that intensity slider becomes really handy. So I'm going to pull that intensity slider down and choose somewhere in between. So if I take it all the way down to 0, we see where we started. And then I can kind of slowly drag that up and find a position where I feel like, you know, that's what I want to represent for this photo. So I'll find something in between. Again, all the way up, it's too much. All the way back, I want it to be a little better than that. And so I find that happy place in between. And let's say maybe right about there is the right way to go. Now I'm feeling like it's a little bit at a funny angle in here. The horizon could be adjusted. I could try and do this with the horizon tool, where I drag this and I position it on something that I know to be the horizon line, but I don't really have a horizon line in here. So I'm not going to do it that way. I'm just going to do it manually. Let's actually reset the horizon, and let's get rid of the guide. And then I'll go in here and just manually adjust that and try and find a happy place for that. And I think right about, actually there, that looks pretty good right there. So it looks like a minus 2.4. And if I wanted to get really precise, I could go in here and, you know, type in minus 2.0, and let's see if that looks a little bit better. So you can go in here and adjust it by adjusting the slider, or go in there and type that number in manually as well. So again, if we compare to the original, you can see the difference in there. So here we have this case where the full auto perspective was too much, but finding that happy medium somewhere in there does work out quite well. And again, as always, we can choose to look at the crop, see how the image has been cropped. So if I turn it back onto auto and then turn on the cropping, we can see it. And if I wanted to, for example, get more of the top of this building fading off into the fog up there, I can do that. Let's go unconstrained and pull that up and get that really tall, skinny image, and decide that that's how I want that to be. And that's cool. That looks good. I like it. So apply that. I dig it. I think it's good. Hit save, and let's bring it back in. Okay, let's do the same idea with this photo here. This is in Chicago. This is the bean for anyone who's been to Chicago before. This image could use a little bit of work before we move into perspective correction. So I'm gonna do a little auto on here, and kind of germane to the discussion about white balance before, the white balance on here feels way too cold. Even if it maybe is accurate, it's just too cold. So I'm gonna manually warm this up just a little bit. Now, an important point that I did not make earlier, gotta find the right happy ground in there. It's right about there. Important point that I didn't make earlier is, since when I send this off to Perspective Efex, I am rendering out a TIFF file. That means that I'm no longer gonna have access to my raw decode process. So I want to do as much work as I can to the image before I send it off. Do as much of the corrective work as I can before I send this off to TIFF, and get that image looking as good as I possibly can. I'm having a hard time deciding how cool or warm I want this, so I'm going to leave it right about there, and maybe bring up a little bit of clarity on there and call it a day. Okay, yeah, that works. We're gonna do that. Okay, but now let's bring this into Perspective Efex. So once again, to reiterate, because I am sending this off as a TIFF file, I do want to do as much of my color correction, corrective, especially recovery work, as I can before I send this off into the plugin. All right, so this is looking as we brought it in, and let's try that auto perspective and see what happens. Hit that auto button, and yeah, too much. In fact, it's not just that it's too much, it's kind of overcorrected. I would guess that this big old distortion in the bean here has confused the software a little bit. This building is just looking a little bit kind of funky. It's kind of stretched out a little bit. So let's try doing a little bit of that intensity slider, bring that down. And in this case, bringing it down a little bit, I would say actually makes it a bit more accurate. So right about there is looking pretty good. Kind of like that, actually. And looking a bit more closely, I feel like it might be It's hard to tell. Maybe it's a little bit too tall. And so let's go to the horizontal vertical ratio slider here and adjust that. And this will allow me, I'm going to overdo it here. This will allow me to stretch the image horizontally or vertically to make up for any overcorrection that might have happened automatically. And again, it's all subjective because we are looking at quite an odd perspective of an image. What do you think looks right? And I'm going to say that looks pretty good there. I dig that. Yeah, I kind of like that. Okay. No, just because it's fun, I always like to undo the crop and just see what happened to the image. And it's pretty wild to see just how much this image has been distorted to get to this result here. I mean, it's pretty crazy to see how much distortion the software has done. And the end result is pretty great there. I mean, if that's what you're looking for, this wide perspective image with nice clean vertical lines, you can absolutely get it. And I kind of like too about this photo that we have these perfectly vertical lines here, and then this massive distortion inside of the bean. I think that's just kind of cool. And if you don't know why I keep calling it the bean, that's just actually what it's called. For those of you who haven't been to Chicago, this is it's the bean. It is the bean. It's this very curious and fun sculpture that is this hanging out in the city. Alrighty, let's see here. Let's move on to, let's do one more corrective image. Yeah, let's do the one more corrective image. Then I'm going to jump into questions again, and then we will do some miniaturization. So this is a photo where kind of hard to know whether this is going to be too much, too not wide, that's the wrong word, whether this is going to be a not wide enough image to be able to correct this without cropping stuff out of it. So the only way to find out is to actually try it. So let's do a quick little auto correction on here. That brings some nice color back into that. Edit in, oops, where do we go? Edit in Perspective Efex. Once again, let that become a TIFF file. And we're going to hit that auto button and see what happens in here and see if we end up losing some of the pillars in here. Hit the auto and cool, we didn't lose any of the pillars, so that's good, but I definitely don't like how it's done this. So here's an interesting point. I've talked multiple times about sometimes the auto doesn't quite do what we want. So what we might do is hit reset and go at it by hand. But what's interesting is after you've hit auto, if you go in and turn on the vertical correction, you'll actually see what the software based it off of. So we can see that it based it off of, well, that pillar and something else. I'm not quite sure what it followed there, but it wasn't quite right. And then it followed it off of this center line, which is quite interesting. If I hide that, we'll see that it used this line, which is actually a gap between this freeway. So this is, by the way, this is New Orleans. I'm standing underneath a freeway, underneath a highway, and we see this gap between the two roads, and the software chose to use that line, which makes sense. I mean, it is one very long line that goes top to bottom in here, but it wasn't a good decision, was it? So let's redo this decision. Let me move these lines over here to the outside edge of these pillars. So let's get it as close to the top as we can. Once again, I want to move this crosshair right on the edge of that pillar. And so I'm going to get it close and then hold down the shift key and move that in, get it just right so. And do the same thing over here, move that whole line over, grab the dot, hold down the shift key, move that nice and slow. Let's actually get it up to the top a bit higher. Get that really nice and accurate, good. Do the same thing down here, right on the edge, good. Preview that, and now that looks way better. So let's apply that. So now we've got nice vertical lines, but my cropping's all messed up. I've cropped out the edge of the pillar here, it's not centered. So let's fix all that. Get into the crop tool. I'm going to get rid of my my aspect ratio. I don't care about the aspect ratio. I want to have just a little bit on the outside edge of each one of these pillars to be showing. And I also want a lot up top because look, this is really cool up here. There's some really neat texture going on. So I kind of want to include that back in, maybe not all of it. Maybe we go somewhere right about there. The bottom, well, the bottom looks like if I want to leave it down here, I'm going to end up with a little bit of a gap in there, but that's an easy thing to fix. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this, and then we're going to fix that in Lightroom using a bit of the healing tool. So let's let this draw itself out. And then once that is done, there we go. Here it comes. Come on, Lightroom, you can do it. Lightroom's thinking. There it goes. There we go. All right. So now let's go ahead and fix this by going into the cloning or healing tool, and let's just try healing. Let's see if that works. If that doesn't work, I'll do a little manual. That didn't quite do it, did it? All right, let's do it. Switch that over to a clone and line that up, and that's pretty good. Could possibly use a little bit more work, but I'm going to call it done. There we go. So now I fixed that little gap in there. All righty, cool. Bring that back out, and yeah, looking pretty good, looking slick. All right, we're going to move into miniaturization next, but before I do that, I'm going to jump back over to the camera and look at my Q&A and see what is happening in here. Next question, can you take the uncropped version back into Photoshop to use content-aware fill? Absolutely. So I kind of just showed that. I cropped it by leaving some gap in there. But if you wanted to have more of a gap and fill in more of those spaces with content-aware fill or the cloning healing brushes, absolutely 100% you can. So there you go. You actually just saw it, just in a very small version of that. Great question. Thank you for asking it. Next one, with DxO PhotoLab, do we need to do all our edits before sending it as a TIFF to Perspective Efex? Okay, there's need and there's should. So the corrections that you, well, okay, there's need and could, let's put it that way. So need and should be the same thing. The corrections that you need / really should do before you send it to a TIFF are corrective. The recovery ones, things like recovering highlight and shadow detail, you really want to do that from the raw file. Also, white balance. White balance is definitely something that you want to do to the raw file. You may not be aware of this, but when you are adjusting white balance on a raw file, it is a completely non-destructive process. The raw file is being decoded with a white balance number attached to it. That number is defined by the camera, but then you can override that in software. You can drag that slider back and forth all day long, and you are never affecting any of the original pixels of the image. It's not like a exposure slider where if you go up and then you do some other stuff and you came back down, up and down, you would eventually kind of corrupt the data. Not in a raw workflow, but if you were to adjust your exposure up and then down again, you would be brightening pixels and then darkening those pixels that were previously brightened. Whereas white balance is always from the original translation as long as you're raw. So just something to consider, that you do want to correct your white balance before you turn it into a TIFF. Now, all that said, some of you might be scratching your head thinking, well, hold on, if I'm in a raw workflow, it doesn't matter what I do to my exposure. And that's true. As long as you're still in the raw workflow, it doesn't matter where you make your exposure adjustments because it's all just math at that point. But once you generate out that TIFF file, you don't want to be doing exposure up and down, up and down. You don't want to be doing white balance up and down, up and down. You don't want to be doing any dramatic adjustments because you will be corrupting the pixels, if you will. So you want to do as much as you can to the raw file before sending it off. Once you get into creative effects, it makes a lot less of a difference to be starting from the raw file. So corrective stuff first, then do your Perspective Efex, and then do your creative on top of that. I hope all that made sense. Okay, let's move on now into miniaturization. Here we go. So we're going to next talk about miniaturization. Miniaturization is so much fun. It is a totally creative effect where you can take a scene like this and make it look like kind of a miniature train set. And so what I want to do here is show a couple images that kind of, or I'm going to start with an image that kind of works, one that definitely does not work, just to show the things to watch out for. And then we're going to go to one that works really, really well. And then we're going to have some fun with some other photos in here. So let's start with something in the middle. Now, to start off, one thing that you'll notice that all of these images have in common, looking at my thumbnails, is they're all taken from an elevated position. If you can either stand up high on a building or get up on a rooftop or even fly a drone to get a picture, you are going to get a photo that works much better for this miniaturization effect than you will if you're standing on the ground. It just works out better. And if you think about what the miniaturization effect is, it's meant to look like kind of a miniature train set photo, a photo of a train set, and you would of course be photographing that from above. So that's just kind of what works. So let's start with this photo here and take this into Perspective Efex. And again, this is a photo that will kind of work, and let's see the reasons why it will or won't work. First thing I want to do here is straighten it out. We can see the horizon's not totally straight in here. I will do an auto horizon and see what happens. and it did pretty much absolutely nothing. So we're going to reset that. That didn't really do anything. I can do a horizontal horizon line, but the problem is that I don't really know where the horizon is. I mean, I've got the horizon of the buildings, but obviously these buildings over here are taller than these here, so that doesn't really make total sense. Okay, let's reset that. So that's not going to work. You do have, and this is quite cool and I think quite unique, is a vertical horizon adjustment tool. So in this situation, I can't tell where the horizontal horizon line is, but I can tell what's supposed to be vertical. So I'm going to go off the biggest known vertical line that I've got in here, which is going to be this church steeple. And I'm going to start by positioning the crosshair right in the middle. And this is a bit interesting. I can't, if we follow this line down the middle, you can see that it would not be this pillar here. You can already tell that's not going to be the center point. So it is very much a kind of a guessing game of where this should be. And you know, obviously that's not going to be right. And obviously that's not going to be right. So I'm going to have to go in here and just kind of guess a little bit and figure it out and go, I think that works good. Let's preview that. And yeah, look, it's just on a little bit of perspective, a little bit of rotation, and it looks great. Now I could do this manually, right, by adjusting that, or I've got this vertical line on there and I apply that, and then there we go. There's my now horizon corrected image without actually having a horizon line. Okay, but we want to look at miniaturization. So I turn on the miniaturization tool. Here's how this works. I start off with a area that I choose what part I want to be in focus, that's the center part, and then I choose how far I want that in focus part to be, and then I choose how far I want the out of focus gradual gradation to spread. So if you will, this interior part is totally in focus. Past the dotted line is totally out of focus or blurred, as the case may be. And then what's in between here is the transition. So if I take this transition line and I make it very short, the transition period from totally in focus to totally out of focus is very short. If I drag it out here like this, it's a much more gradual transition. And so with this, I can narrow this band to define the area that I want to be in focus, and then decide how gradual I want that out of focus to be. And I can choose from here how much out of focus I want it to be. So if I go all the way up, this gets super out of focus. If I take this way, way down, just give it a tiny bit, it's only slightly out of focus. And so the amount that you do is totally dependent on the photo and of course the creative effect that you want to achieve. So let's do this. Let's make this look like a miniaturization effect with this row of buildings here being the part in focus. I want to, let's see, I want to make sure that the top of the building doesn't go out of focus. So if I was to bring this down like so, and let's do this kind of incorrectly here, let's do it like this, we can see here that this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that the top of the steeple would be blurry. What we're trying to do is simulate a narrow band of focus, but a narrow band of focus would include the top of that building. So this doesn't make sense. So this doesn't work. Okay, let's go back into the miniaturization tool and let's expand this so that we get that whole building in. We want to make sure that that is at least mostly, and I mean, you can get away with a little bit of blurring up there. Maybe we can narrow this down a little bit. And this is starting to look pretty good there. Let's actually make it a little bit stronger as well. Let's make this a little bit stronger. So I did take that way down. Let's make it a little bit stronger in there. Okay, and so now we're getting somewhere, but we do have a problem. Well, other than the fact that I just messed up that building top. Let's bring that back up a little bit again. Bring that up a little bit higher there. There we go. Other than that building top, there is another problem, and it's this crane. This crane sticking up in here doesn't make sense. It's reaching into the band of focus, but this crane clearly is way forward in the shot. So this doesn't really work. Now, if I crop the image, let's just do this. Let's do something really dramatic. And I just crop all of that crane out of the photo. I do something like this. Now we can get something a bit more believable, but I mean, we've lost 90% of the image here, so that's no fun. So that really doesn't work for us. So this type of an image doesn't quite work out. And it really is because of this thing sticking up in the middle in here. Okay, so that doesn't work. I mean, it kind of works, but not really. A photo like this doesn't work at all. And let's take a look at why this one doesn't work at all. Let's go ahead and edit in Perspective Efex. And this is basically the same reason that the previous photo didn't work, whereas before we just had a little bit of a crane. Well, here we've got a whole set of buildings in the front. So let me do a quick little auto perspective on there, fix that, excellent, looking good. this looks like it would be a great miniaturization effect. If I took this narrow band of building back here and made that all in focus and the rest of it out of focus, that would look really cool. But because these buildings that are way farther forward are going to get in the way of that, it's just not going to work. Look, if I take this, make this really small, let's make this a nice small band off to the back of that photo in there. That would look really cool for this part of it, but the buildings up here make that not work. So I'm showing you what doesn't work to show that this effect just doesn't work for all photos. You have to have the right type of photo. Okay, so what type of photo does it work on? Well, let's do that on this one. This photo is going to be great for this. And this is going to be great for this for a couple of reasons. First of all, we don't have anything intersecting the lines of where I want this narrow band of focus to be. So whether I want the narrow band of focus to be all the way in the back here, or up in the middle, or up front, there's no big vertical thing sticking up in the middle that's just going to mess that up. So let's go into the miniaturization effect and let's make it pretty small. I want to make this pretty dramatic in here because when you've got people, man, this works so well with people in the photos. I mean, just like that. Take a look at that. Super fun. You end up with this very believable small model train set looking thing where you've got these tiny little people and this really narrow band of focus, and it just looks so cool. Let's try a different position of this. Let's move this up to the top here and see how that looks. Move it up to the top there, maybe make it even more narrow and apply that and see how that works. And that works really well too. I think it worked better up in the foreground. Let's try it all the way up in the foreground. It's just really fun to try different positions of this to see what does and doesn't work. I mean, doesn't that really just look like a little model train set? I think it's fabulous. It's super fun. So this is the kind of photo that this sort of thing works really well. I'm gonna go ahead and apply that. I dig that. This is the kind of photo where this works really well. So you don't have those vertical interrupting lines like we had from the building, or even ones sneaking in like you had from the crane over here. So you just got to be careful with what type of image you're going to work with this on. Let's do this one next. This one's aerial. So these first ones, this was taken from a bridge. I think this is in Sweden. I believe that was from a bridge. This is taken from a nearby very tall building. This one's also from a bridge over going over this roadway here. This one's a drone shot. This is shot from a drone. So this one is, even though it's a bunch of tall buildings, I was able to get high enough where this probably is going to work. So let's give it a try. We'll take this into the tool and let's once again start with a little bit of perspective correction, a little auto correction on there, and boom, those buildings are all nice and vertical in there, looking pretty good. Add a little bit of miniaturization effect. Let's focus on the fountain. Let's see what works here. Make that pretty narrow. We got people in there too, so we're kind of getting the best of everything in here. Narrow that down. Maybe we let's straighten that line out just a little bit there. Give it a really good heavy blur on there. Yeah, it totally works, doesn't it? I mean, that's super believable and that's kind of fun. Actually, I wonder if I turn off the perspective correction. Yeah, I guess I don't really need to bother doing the perspective correction on this one because everything's going to get so blurred out back there that it's just going to look believable anyway. So that's kind of fun. Let's see what happens if I move this up to the building line. So a little bit farther off. We're probably going to need a bit of a bigger band in here to encompass all those vertical buildings that are all in the same plane. And yeah, we're gonna have to be careful about this up here. So let's make that up a little bit. Get that up about like so. Yeah, oh yeah, that kind of works. Maybe a little bit less, a little bit too strong on there. It totally works. Yeah, maybe not as effective as the fountain, but it works. Maybe we should turn that perspective correction back on. Let's go back into auto mode there. That works pretty well. Okay, cool. All right, good. Moving on. I got two more photos that I really want to show you in here. This one is just funny because there actually is a train track. That's me. This is like my very first drone out flying it, just learning how to fly, having some fun. Let me open this in Perspective Efex. Because there is a train track, it's just funny because we can make this truly look like a model train set, which is where this whole idea comes from, the photograph of the model train set. And if I put this down on the train tracks, we really do get a totally believable model train set image. I just think it's funny. I just thought it was kind of an amusing thing to show, so I wanted to show you how that worked in there. All right, we're gonna apply that one. I dig that. Let's go to this one next. So now this one's not going to work particularly well, but I'm going to show you a part of the tool that I haven't gotten to show you yet that while it doesn't necessarily work for this image, may work for an image that you've got, and I want you to be aware of the tool set. So first of all, I'm going to go back to the miniaturization effect, and because this is a train image again, I'm a train track, I'm going to go ahead and rotate the perspective here to be following the train tracks. So there we go, following the train tracks. Now it doesn't work because this is weird, getting the building up there. I mean, the mountain range up there just doesn't really quite work. What I really want, at least what I think I want, is some kind of like an overlapping blur. I kind of want to follow this line this direction, and I want to follow it this direction. But as I move these things, they all move together. But do they have to? They do not. So check this out. If I go down to miniature effect and I disable symmetry position, now I can independently move these lines around. So I can do something like this. Let's follow that edge of the roadway, and then let's follow that edge of the train track. Let's go right about there. And you can see I'm getting this overlap. Now, again, it doesn't totally work in here, but it is kind of a cool thing you can do. You can even adjust the fall off independently. And now if I go in and I adjust the blur, it is adjusting the amount of blur on both sides as we saw before. However, I can go in here and turn off symmetrical blur, and now I actually have independent blur amounts as well. So you really do have an immense amount of control in here. Again, it doesn't really work for this photo, and honestly, I couldn't find a photo where this worked really, really well in, but I did want to show you the tool because I think it is incredibly powerful that you have this capability to go in there and not just do a miniaturization effect based off of a single band, but you can go in there and totally independently manipulate these bands and just, I mean, look, you can do something completely wacky and weird. Again, I don't know exactly how it worked, where it worked, but you can do it. You can do it, which I think is kind of neat. Actually, it kind of works. Let's just try. I want to do a reset on this. I'm going to try real quick, see what it looks like if I do just a good old-fashioned normal band on there. See how that looks. And I mean, that does work, right? And again, the train tracks in there really do help sell it as a miniaturization effect image on the train tracks, which is kind of what we expect to see. It's kind of fun. Also, you can change your blur shape down here, which is kind of interesting. Depending on the type of image that you're looking at, you may or may not see much of a difference in the blur, but I just want to point that out again as something else that you might want to play with in there. It's kind of fun to work with. Alrighty. Let's jump back over to the questions real quick, and before we wrap this thing up, how do you preview the horizontal and vertical lines used to crop? How to show the grid lines? Got it. Now I understand. Okay, let me go back into a crop. Let's get a good image to crop with. Let's go back into the perspective, the original one, and let's take this photo. I'm gonna start over from this original image in here because I think this will be a good way to show this off. We're gonna start all over, edit that in Perspective Efex, and open this up. And I'm going to do the basic auto perspective correction and then bring up the crop tool. So with the crop tool, what they're asking about is these lines here. I have these grid lines that are showing up in here. That is enabled or disabled with this checkbox down here, show grid. So this allows me to either get rid of it and just have a much cleaner view of the scene. And now I can, let's turn off the constrained aspect ratio. I can crop this however I want. Set that however I like on there and just have nothing cluttering up the image in between. Or I click on show grid, and now I have this rule of thirds grid on there, which if I wanted to say have my horizon line on the bottom third, I could use that guide for that. Maybe I want to move this over so that there's a line on here. So now I've got one line on this grid line and one line on that grid line, and this is going to be a quote unquote more balanced image if you subscribe to the idea of rule of thirds, which is it's a great rule to start with and then a wonderful rule to break. So there's that. Another tool that you have in here is this mask opacity. It starts off at a 40% default. If I take this all the way down to 0, the outside of the masked area goes completely black. If I take it all the way up, then we see the entire original image. All this is just for visualization. It just can make it easier to see where you are cropping. That's all that is. Doesn't have any effect on the final output. It's just a visualization tool. Apply that and off we go. Next question is, are there advantages to using Perspective Efex compared to Lightroom's transform adjustments? There are more controls inside of Perspective Efex, and I have absolutely found that for some images, the auto Perspective Efex correction in Perspective Efex works flawlessly, where in Lightroom, the auto one doesn't work at all. Clearly, you can do a lot of this work in Lightroom without having to go into a plugin. So I think for a lot of people, the right answer is to try the Lightroom one, hit the auto apply, see how that works. If that works, great. But if it doesn't, or you just want more creative control over it, then jump into the Perspective Efex tool. Again, there is definitely a bit of overlapping in the tool set there. You have a lot of things that are the same in both, but you do have quite a bit of additional correction effects inside of Perspective Efex than you would in Lightroom on its own. And next question, where was the photo that you took that looked like a third world country? Interesting. Let's see which photo you might be talking about. Where you looked like a third world country. You might be, well, you could be talking about this, which would be Los Angeles, or perhaps you were talking about this photo, which was in India in the Kumbh Mela, largest gathering of human beings on planet Earth. I was there. It was awesome. And this is, my hometown, so hopefully that doesn't look like a third world country. Hopefully that is probably the photo you were talking about, but that is India during the Kumbh Mela. Okay, that is all the questions we've got today. So that's it, everybody. There are no more questions popping up, so thank you once again. I appreciate your time today. Your time is all very valuable, so I appreciate you choosing to spend some of it with me today. Hope you learned something, hope you had fun, and we'll see you out there in another webinar or on the social media. Take care, everybody.